Hey guys, today I'm going to be giving my prediction for the 2020 Senate elections. The 2020 Senate is looking like it's going to be extremely competitive, and some of the races are really interesting, and it's been really fun to follow, maybe even more so than the presidential election. So what I'm going to throw up on the screen right now is what the general consensus is among pundits. So this just shows the toss-up states and the lean and likely states. But I'm going to go through and I'm going to put my own map on the screen, and then the states that I want to talk about I've left blank, and I'm just going to get right into it. But before I do, please make sure to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. So the first state that I'm going to talk about is Kansas. So right now Barbara Bollier is the Democratic nominee, and she's going to face one of any of the GOP nominees. Where Kansas becomes competitive is if Chris Kobach wins the GOP primary. In 2018, Kobach was running for governor, and he lost against a Democrat, Laura Kelly, and then he was unseated. And so Democrats actually picked up a governor's race in Kansas. Kansas is a state that voted for Trump by like 20 points, so this is pretty astronomical. And Laura Kelly actually won her race over Chris Kobach by 5 points. And Laura Kelly and Barbara Bollier are kind of similar candidates, as they're moderate Democrats that appeal to voters on both sides of the aisle. And they do really well against a candidate like Chris Kobach, who has a very low approval rating. People across the state really do not like him. Additionally, Barbara Bollier has had some really strong fundraising numbers. She outraised all of her Republican opponents, and she has a lot of statewide endorsements. And in head-to-head polling, she actually is leading against Chris Kobach in various polls, head-to-head. So anything really is possible. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2020 on election night. I think that Kansas is a Republican Senate seat. Given that it's a presidential election year, it is probably going to vote for Trump, and because of that, it's probably going to vote for the Republican nominee. If Chris Kobach does win the GOP primary, then things get a little interesting, but it's unclear who's going to win that right now, so a lot of things would have to happen for Democrats to pick up that seat, and that's why I put it as a Republican one. Michigan, on the other hand, John James is a Republican. He's a rising star in the Republican Party in Michigan, and he's facing incumbent Democrat Gary Peters. He's actually been able to outraise Gary Peters, John James has. However, most political pundits rate Michigan as a lean or likely Democratic Senate seat. Polling numbers are looking pretty strong for Peters in the state. He's leading James by double digits in pretty much every poll that comes out. Additionally, Biden is doing really well in the state, and so that also doesn't necessarily work for John James's favor. If he wants to unseat a Democrat, he's probably going to have to lead by quite a bit going into the election, and he's not right now. So I put Michigan as a Democrat. They keep it. So the next state that I want to talk about is Georgia, and specifically Georgia's special election. So Georgia's special election is another one that's really interesting. So the primary, there is no primary right now, so it's going to be a jungle primary on election day, and that means that all the candidates are going to be on the ballot, and if nobody wins an outright majority, which is pretty certain that that's going to happen, then it goes to a runoff election. And so this Senate seat probably wouldn't be too contested. However, there is a pretty strong Democratic nominee with Reverend Raphael Warnock, and then there are two GOP candidates on the ticket that are in real contention to win, and that is Senator Kelly Loeffler and Representative Doug Collins. So Collins has more statewide recognition, but Loeffler appeals more to the suburban voters, these swing voters that are going to be really integral for both parties in 2020, like around Atlanta and the big city there. So they all have their niches that they appeal to, so it'll be pretty interesting to see what happens there. It's looking like it's going to be Loeffler and Collins are fighting it out for the GOP seat, and then Reverend Raphael Warnock is going to take the Democratic base, and he's going to advance to the runoff election. And if that happens, then potentially that could open the door for a Democrat to pick up the Georgia Senate seat, but it's still favored to go to the Republican Party. In polling, it's looking pretty competitive, but again, polls right now are pretty weak for the Republican Party, and I would expect them to shift more in their favor as election day nears. So I'm putting that one as Republican. The next state that I'm talking about is Texas. Now, Texas In 2018, there was a Senate election out of the state, Beto O'Rourke versus Ted Cruz, and Beto came extremely close. However, Beto was a very charismatic, a very well-liked figure in Texas politics, and Ted Cruz wasn't as well-liked. He wasn't as charismatic. He didn't campaign as heavily. This cycle, it's the Democratic nominee isn't even, there's a primary runoff, so it's MJ Hagar or Royce West facing off versus John Cornyn. And all three of these candidates don't have the sort of recognition that Ted Cruz or Beto O'Rourke had in 2018. So they're not as, well known, they don't have as much notoriety, and because of coronavirus and no campaigning, it's really looking like Texas isn't going to be competitive at all. This one is definitely going to be a Republican. They're going to keep it. Another Republican state that might be a little more competitive is Iowa. So Iowa was just moved as a toss-up state by Real Clear Politics. They moved it from a lean Republican to a toss-up. So Senator Joni Ernst is facing the presumptive nominee of Teresa Greenfield. This race is kind of going to be a coin toss. Right now, Greenfield is leading in polling. Pretty much every poll that comes out, she has a 3-point lead. There was a very highly rated polling company, Seltzer & Co. They came out with a poll that showed her with a 3-point lead. And Trump's actually winning in Iowa right now by a pretty small margin, but the fact that Trump is winning and Greenfield still has a polling lead in Iowa, that does not necessarily pan out well. Iowa has a lot of independent voters, and because Joni Ernst's approval rating is so low in the state, that means that theoretically, a lot of these voters could switch up their vote. They could vote a Republican for the president, vote Democrat for the senator, and because of that, Iowa definitely has the potential to toss up, but just the fact that Joni Ernst is, pretty well known. She's pretty close in the polls. 3 points isn't too much of a lead if Republicans are going to make gains in their approval ratings closer to election season as Donald Trump starts campaigning more and stuff like that. I do still think that Republicans have the edge in Iowa, but this is certainly one to keep your eyes peeled on because it started out as a lean Republican and now it's looking more like a toss-up, and if it keeps trending that way, Democrats might be able to pick up a seat in Iowa, which would definitely help their chances at gaining a Senate majority. Okay, now I'm going to move over to Montana, and out of all the Senate races that are going on right now, Montana is my favorite. So, what we're seeing is incumbent Republican Steve Daines is facing Democrat Governor Steve Bullock. So both of these are pretty well known, but Steve Bullock is actually an extremely well-liked figure in Montana politics. His approval rating has skyrocketed because of his handling of the coronavirus. In April, it was around 66% approve, 19% disapprove, and so it's only projected to have gone up from there. Additionally, Steve Bullock is winning by around 7 points with polls that are 1 to 2 months old, and his approval rating has assumed to be higher since then. I don't know if that made sense, but his approval rating is assumed to be higher right now than it was a month or two ago, so his polling data would probably be even stronger. So if the election were held today, I do think that the Democrats would pick up Montana without any problem. The difficulty comes is that Donald Trump will be on the ballot in 2020, and Montana is an extremely, extremely strong state for him. However, in 2018, John Tester, a Democrat, did win in Montana. He's another very popular figure in statewide politics, and Steve Bullock is actually arguably even more popular, so really anything could happen with this one as well. I give this one to the Democrats just because of Steve Bullock's fundraising lead, his polling lead, and his favorability rating against someone like Steve Daines, who isn't as well liked or well known in Montana politics. So this is definitely one to keep your eyes on. It should certainly be really interesting. I'm going to talk about North Carolina now, and the North Carolina Senate race is another one looking like a real nail-biter. Democrat Cal Cunningham fought off a Republican-funded primary challenge. The Republican Party funded a very progressive candidate as a way to try and get a progressive on the ticket and make it easier for the Republican Party to win. However, Cal Cunningham still won the primary, and now he's facing Thom Tillis. And Tillis is not a very popular figure in North Carolina politics. He's very closely linked to Trump right now, and Trump isn't super popular in the state. However, Trump still is pretty competitive, so if his polling numbers were to go up at all, then he would probably win North Carolina fairly easily. So right now, if Tillis stays connected to Trump and Trump does better, then Tillis will win. In head-to-head polling right now, it's looking like it's a dead heat, and just because Thom Tillis is the incumbent is why I'm going to give this one to this state to Republicans. Moving over to Maine. Maine is seeing Susan Collins, a longtime senator. She's been a senator for over 20 years in the state. She came in as kind of this Washington outsider. She said she was only going to serve 2 terms, and now she's been in the Senate for like 24 years or something, like 26 years, something like crazy. So she's finally facing competition from a Democratic challenger, Sarah Gideon. Sarah Gideon is, I think she's the Speaker of the Maine House, so she's pretty popular in Maine politics, but not as well known as Susan Collins, so she's definitely got to get her name recognition up. However, Susan Collins is among the most disliked senators in the United States. After she voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, put him on the Supreme Court, and then voted not to impeach Trump, a lot of Mainers saw her as out of touch and really working for the Republican Party over the interests of Maine, because Maine is a pretty liberal state. So her approval rating has dropped. It's gone as low as 42%. Gideon in polls has only been increasing lately. It started as a dead heat, and then next month she was leading by a point. Next month a new poll came out, she was leading by 3 points, and now she has a 9-point lead over Susan Collins. I definitely think that Sarah Gideon is a strong candidate. I've been following her for a while. She's a good fundraiser. She's a well-liked figure. She's a good speaker, and if she just continues to increase her name recognition, she'll probably build her lead over Susan Collins, who really can't do much to improve her reputation among Mainers. Again, it is going to be hard to unseat this longtime incumbent who historically has been a well-liked figure in Maine politics, but I do think that Sarah Gideon is a new, fresh face, and people will like her. Moving over to states that I think are more likely to change, so I have 3 left: Alabama, Colorado, and Arizona, and all 3 of these I do think are going to flip parties. So Doug Jones in Alabama won in 2018. He faced a special election against Roy Moore, the Republican incumbent, because Moore was facing serious allegations about sexual misconduct with minors. For a second, it looked like Moore might actually win the GOP primary for the 2020 election, in which case Doug Collins might have a really competitive Senate race. However, at this point, it's looking like either Jeff Sessions or Tommy Tuberville is going to win the nomination and face off against Doug Collins. And if that's the case, they're probably going to, for sure, win the Senate seat. Polling data out of Alabama does show a fairly competitive race, within 10 points or so, but it's not anything to say that Democrats might be able to clinch a seat unless something goes terribly wrong for the GOP in Alabama. Doug Jones will almost surely lose his seat. This is a deep red state, so it would be kind of foolish to think that Democrats could pull off a win in a presidential election year. Moving over to Colorado. Colorado is another state that's looking increasingly likely to flip. So John Hickenlooper was the former governor, and then he dropped out to run for president. He did not seek re-election in 2018. And he's facing Republican incumbent Cory Gardner. And Cory Gardner is another one of these Republicans who's pretty closely linked to Trump and not well liked in the state. His approval rating is extremely low, and as Colorado becomes more and more liberal, he's becoming more and more unpopular. John Hickenlooper has close to a 20-point lead over Cory Gardner, so I think it's almost certain that John Hickenlooper does win the Colorado Senate seat. This is one of the seats that's most likely to flip, I think, after Alabama. And the last seat that I think is pretty likely to flip is Arizona. So Arizona is my favorite Senate race, or at least Senate candidate. Mark Kelly is a former astronaut, and he's married to gun violence prevention advocate Gabby Giffords. She is a gun violence survivor, and she's a very popular figure in Arizona politics. Mark Kelly is as well. And he's facing off against Martha McSally. McSally was running for Senate in 2018 against Democrat Kyrsten Sinema, and then she lost, and she was appointed to the empty Senate seat in Arizona afterwards, and she's not a very liked figure in Arizona. Getting appointed to a seat where you just lost an election is kind of not a great look. She doesn't have a high approval rating. She's pretty closely linked to Trump in a state where Trump is not, he's kind of fading out. He's not that popular anymore. So Martha McSally is not looking like she's going to keep her seat. In polling data, Mark Kelly is close to double digits ahead in every single poll that comes out. Mark Kelly is also proven to be an astronomical fundraiser, no pun intended, but he's been a really strong fundraiser, outraising McSally in pretty much every cycle by close to 2 times as much, and he has more money or more cash on hand, so he will be able to spend extremely heavily as election season nears. So I do think that Arizona is going to go blue. And I actually think that Mark Kelly could wind up helping Joe Biden because he's such a strong candidate. He could actually help Joe Biden win Arizona over Trump. But that's just my speculation, my 2 cents. So this is my prediction for the Senate map. And this actually puts the Senate at 50-50. So that would mean whoever wins the presidential nomination will control the Senate if this is what happens. Right now, there are some forecasts that show that Democrats are actually more likely than not to win the Senate, just because the Democrats are really playing offense, and there are so many seats that they could pick up theoretically. You know, Iowa is in play, North Carolina is in play, Kansas is in play, Montana is in play, Texas theoretically is in play, Georgia, both the special election and the regular election theoretically are in play, even Texas. So there are a lot of states that they could go after, whereas Republicans just don't necessarily have that option. Michigan is really the only state that they could reasonably go after. New Hampshire maybe a little bit, but not quite. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2020. If Democrats do turn out in really large numbers, it would not be surprising for them to take the Senate, take the majority, or get this tie like I've predicted, and then we'll see what happens. If they, were this successful and they got to 50, I would assume that Joe Biden is doing pretty well and he would win the nomination. But if he doesn't and Donald Trump winds up winning, then it would be 50-50 and the vice president would be the tiebreaker vote, and then Republicans would still have a majority, but whatever. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and share and comment, and turn on post notifications. Seriously, please subscribe, and thank you guys so much for watching. All right.